Today, let's talk about the helpers. And in order to demonstrate the helpers, I prepared this nice little landscape here using World Blender Pro. And in this landscape, I have this hydro simulation node to introduce some additional water into the landscape. And also, the simulation is very slow, so I don't want to rerun the simulation every time I do something to the landscape. So I turn off this base landscape and I import it into another object, and then I do other things on this object. Doing it this way, I don't have to rerun the simulation every time I change something here. So anyway, let's have a look at the helpers. For World Blender Pros, these are the helpers that are available at this point. And for World Blender Basics, we have these 4 little helpers. The first helper that I want to talk about is the Landscape to Object helper. Now, this helper will delete a lot of the data channels within the landscape and turn it into a regular object. So after this node, if you put in, let's say, a displacement node like this, it's not going to work because this is no longer a landscape, it's an object. Alright, let's take a closer look. Here you can assign the material for the landscape, and you can choose to shade smooth or shade flat. Let's turn off the shade smooth and let's wait. Alright, this is the landscape without the shade smooth. Alright, so let me just turn back on the shade smooth. And we will talk about this height channel later in another video. The convexity is a function that generates the convexity map for the rendering. Let me just render this real quick and go to the shader editor, and I can visualize the convexity here. Alright, so this is the convexity generated using the helper. So let me go back to the helper. First, the convexity radius. So if you increase this to, let's say, 32, then it's gonna ignore a lot of the smaller details and just select the bigger details. And you can increase the quality of the convexity map using this parameter. For example, I can increase this to 4. And of course, it's gonna be slower to run a higher quality. But as you can see, we have more details in the convexity map. Okay, let me go back to the shader editor and let's normalize the convexity. All right. And next is the water mesh. Currently, it's already turned on, so you can see the landscape has this nice water mesh on top of the landscape. But let me turn it off real quick. And there we go. So within the landscape, there is a water data, and this node will make use of that water data to generate the water mesh. Now, this default material for the water is already pretty good, but if you want to use your own material, you can just make one and choose the material here. All right, and let me go to wireframe and find the place where the water meet the landscape. All right, it's around here. Alright, so you can increase this threshold to ignore the parts where there is not a lot of water, right? So for example, I can increase this to 1, and the parts where we have less than 1 meter of water will be ignored, like that. And this is the water mesh, and as you can see, it's not as good. So be careful when you change this threshold. So let me just set this back to default 0.01, and let's wait again for the node to run. Okay, so that is the functionality of the landscape to object helper. Next, let's have a look at this update landscape mesh. Let's drop it in, and we can select the height channel that we want to visualize here. By default, there is a height channel called height, but there are actually multiple height channels within the landscape. I'm going to show you how to create your custom height channels later, but for now, after eroding this landscape, there are a few different height channels, for example, the bedrock channel. Alright, so you can see this is the rock part of the mountain without the dirt. And you can also visualize, let's say, the debris channel. And this is the dirt part of the landscape. Okay. And there is also a water channel. which is the amount of water that the landscape has. So that's the update landscape mesh, all right? Now this is also useful when you manually manipulate the height channel. For example, let's create a named attribute node here and call in the height attribute. And I'm gonna create a map node like this, all right? And here I'm gonna store the named attribute height. There we go. All right, so now you can manually change the height channel by doing this. So by default, if you change this height channel like this, it's not gonna show up here, but you can update the landscape mesh using this node to visualize the change to this height channel. Okay, next we have the move landscape. This one is rather simple. You just move the landscape like that. Alright, the next helper node that I want to talk about belongs to the World Blender Pro. So let me go to World Blender Pro real quick, and it's this particular node right here, the Warp Landscape node. Now in order to demonstrate this node, we need to create a new landscape, so let's drop in a create landscape real quick. Alright, and let me drop in the Warp Landscape. There we go. Now by itself, the Warp Landscape will not do anything. The landscape remains unchanged. So in order to see the effect of the warp, we need a displacement node. And let me see, maybe use this radial displacement. All right. So this is the radial displacement after warping, and this is before warping. So what this warp landscape does is that it warps the internal texture coordinate of the landscape. So any displacement that comes after this warp landscape node will be distorted. Like, for example, I can add in, let's say, this chip displacement, and you can see the chip displacement is also warped, and this is the chip displacement without the warp, right? So using this warp landscape, you can create a much more believable looking rock, for example, like this, right? And you can increase this scale to increase the scale of the warp, and same for the details. Down here you have the strength of the warp. This is the overall strength, and these are the strength in certain direction. You can also chain together multiple warping node. For example, I can drop in another node, and this time I'm going to warp at a smaller scale. Let's say 50, like that. And as you can see, now I have a much more believable looking landscape. This is the chip displacement without the warp. As you can see, it's not very believable. And this is with the warping. It looks a lot more interesting, right? Now, this warp landscape node also works with this particular shape displacement node. So let me create a curve real quick using curve primitive, and let's say curve circle. Let's see the curved circle. Let's make this, let's say 500 meters, maybe a little smaller, and move it a little bit. All right, now let's put this in here. There we go. So as you can see, the warp also works with this shape displacement. So let me show you. This is without the warp, and this is with the warp. So using this method, you can create, say, a volcano. Let's say something like this, right? And increase the height like so, and also increase the steepness a little bit like that, and maybe spread out a little more. So you see we have a nice little volcano right here. Now, what if you want to cancel the warping after a certain node? For example, I don't want any warping after this shape displacement node. And let's say I want to create a ramp like this. And as you can see, the warp nodes kind of warp the gradient displacement as well. And what if I don't want that? I want the displacement to be perfectly straight like this. Well, there is a node to let you do that. and that is the reset texture coordinate node. You just drop it in and it will get rid of the warping and restore everything to default like that. And next is the resample landscape node. So let me just drop this in here and drop in here. So you see it's resampling the landscape. However, there is a bit of a limitation to this node because this node actually create a new landscape and transfer the data over. And with the current version of Blender, there is no way to automatically transfer all the different data onto the new landscape. So I have here is a default height channel to transfer the height and additional channels to transfer over. So as you can see, this is not an ideal way to resample the landscape, but it's the only way that I know with the current build of Blender. So yeah. And finally, we have this blend landscape node. Now, let's say you have different landscapes. Let me set this to, let's say, 500, like that, and displace it using this node. There we go. And now I can blend these together. And let's see. And let me just configure this landscape a little bit. So you see it's blending the landscape. This is landscape 2, and this is landscape 1, and this is the blend between the two. So basically it's using the higher landscape. Let me set this to 1000. Let me make it a little higher. Now maybe lower this to 1000 and increase the height offset like that. So you see it's blending the landscape, and you can increase this blend distance to smooth out the blending between the two landscapes. And one important thing that you must keep in mind is that the landscape 2 will be blended into landscape 1. So the new landscape is actually the landscape 1 with the landscape 2 blend into it. Alright, that's it. Those are the helpers that World Blender has to offer, the free version and the pro version. I hope you find these helpers useful in your project, and in the next video I'm going to talk about the utilities of World Blender. Okay, I'll see you next time.